I am commanding you today for your own well-being and that of your descendants after you, so that you may long remain in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for all time. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And now please join me in the reading from the Gospel of Luke. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever." Holy wisdom, holy word, please be seated.
So I'm going to invite Mike Clawson, our guest preacher, to come up. We're thankful for him to offer the gift of the word today. He is a church historian. He is the coordinator of the New Story Festival, which will be happening in the spring. He's going to tell you a little bit more about that. But the sort of highlight he gave me was that it's like the Wild Goose Festival, if you've heard of that, but in an urban context, which is really cool. So, and I'm excited it gets to happen in our backyard here in Austin. So, Mike, over to yours.
Good morning, y'all.
Good morning.
First, I just want to say thank you again to Becca for inviting me to preach this morning. As she mentioned, we've been friends since seminary, back when she was an intern, a member here, I guess. So I've heard lots of good things about y'all for years and years. So I'm very honored and grateful to be with you this morning and tell you a little bit about what I've been working on, this thing that we call the New Story Festival. And so, full disclosure, this is going to be a sermon, but it's also just an unapologetic sales pitch and an invitation to your involvement. This festival has been a labor of love, a gift that we want to give to your church and to this community, to Austin, and we need your help. So what I want to do this morning is share with you the theology and the vision that underlies our festival, this thing that we call the New Story. It's been said that the world is not made of atoms, it is made of stories, and I believe that. The world runs on stories. Our lives consist of stories. All of us were born into narratives that help us define our place in the world. Stories about our childhoods and our families, our personalities and our ideals, our careers, our relationships, our successes, and our failures. Sometimes the stories we tell help us make sense of our lives, find meaning and contentment. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes our stories are destructive and dysfunctional. Our society works the same way. Our personal stories exist within larger cultural narratives that shape our values, identities, and goals as a society. There are cultural stories about fame, fortune, and the good life. There are religious stories about just who and what are uniquely blessed by God and who and what are not. There are political stories about freedom, democracy, American exceptionalism. And of course, there's variations on these stories based on whether you live in a red state or a blue state, in the city or the country, in Austin or not Austin. We tell these stories because we believe they'll help us achieve peace and prosperity. And yet, just like our personal stories, these big cultural narratives can help us or hurt us, lead us down paths that divide and destroy, or ones that connect and heal. This is why, as we read in the scripture this morning, God is constantly telling the Israelites to rehearse the story of what God had done for them, so they wouldn't be led astray into more destructive stories. And this is the same reason that we, as Christians, continue to gather weekly for songs, scriptures, and sermons, to remind ourselves of that same divine story that gives us our own identity as a people of God. So this morning, rather than just preaching at you, I want to tell you a story. It's a parable that my friends Brian McLaren and Gareth Higgins wrote to describe 6 of the most common destructive cultural narratives that pop up throughout human history, and then to suggest a new and better story. They call it the parable of the 7th story. It goes like this. The people lived in a beautiful valley. They had clean water, healthy food, and fresh air. They are strong in body and happy in heart, usually. From time to time, outsiders would come to kill and to steal. I know what we should do, the big men said. We should form an army to hurt the outsiders. Then they will fear us, and we will always be safe. So they formed an army and attacked the outsiders. They killed many, took some as slaves, and forced every outsider to pay them money every year. The people felt safe again. But a few years later, the outsiders formed an even bigger army and made war against the people. They killed many, took some away as slaves, and forced the people to pay them money every year. The people remembered the better days of the past and were very sad. Here's what we must do, the big men said. We must cause chaos and terror until the outsiders leave us alone. Then we will be happy. So the people agreed to cause chaos and terror for the outsiders. And after a long time, after many killings and much suffering, the outsiders left them alone. After years of war and chaos, the people worked hard to rebuild. They built cities and banks and stores. They built silos to store extra food. They built a wall and an army for protection. A few became very rich, but most were very poor. The big men, who were the richest of the rich, said, "This is how it must be. If you do what we say and work harder than your neighbor, then you will grow to be richer and richer like us. Then we will have more and more wealth stored away, and we can afford a bigger army and a higher wall to protect our wealth, and all will be well." But all was not well. The poor people worked harder and harder, but they got no richer. They grew angry that they had to pay for the army and the wall that protected the wealth of the big men. The big men grew afraid of the poor people's anger. They got an idea. Short people, the big men said, they are our problem. They are lazy and dishonest. They're causing trouble among us. They are no better than outsiders. If we cleansed our land of short people, we would be great again. So first a few, then nearly everyone united against all the shortest of people. They arrested them, did terrible things to them, things that are only spoken of in whispers. For a while, everyone felt better, but the poor were still poor, and the rich were still rich, and now everyone had a new fear. Maybe this will happen again and again, and one day I will be the shortest of people, and everyone will come after me. The people grew weary from the wars, the chaos, the hard work, and the fear. They cut down too many trees for weapons, buildings, and fire. The farmers didn't renew the soil, and the land stopped producing crops. The people polluted the water so there were no fish, and they dirtied the air with so much smoke that the birds flew away and children got sick. The big men said, "We must leave this place. We will find a new valley far away from everyone else. There we will be safe forever." So the people began a long journey, looking for a better valley where they could be safe forever. But every valley they came to was already full of cities, each with armies to defend it from outsiders. So there was no place to settle down. Finally, they made an encampment in a dry plain where no one else wanted to live. They survived, but life was very difficult. "For us," the people cried. "Everyone's against us. Life isn't fair. If only we were still in our valley," they complained. There was talk, once again, of blaming the shortest people for their troubles. A poet had been watching all that happened among the people. One night, the poet made a campfire on the edge of the camp. A few of the young came to warm themselves by the fire. "What has happened to us?" they asked. And she spoke these words. "We lived by the domination story, us over them, and war led to war. We lived by the revolution story, us seeking revenge on them, and chaos led to chaos. We lived by the accumulation story, all competing with all, and greed led to greed. We lived by the purification story, the big among us cleansing the land of the small among us, and fear led to fear. We lived by the isolation story, us apart from them, and sadness led to sadness. And now we live by the victimization story, us in spite of them, and resentment leads to resentment." Is there no other story we can live by, the young asked? Are we doomed to live these 6 stories forever? There is a 7th story, said the poet. I fear we're not ready to hear it. Please tell us, the young said. We're tired of these 6 stories. They offer us no future but war, chaos, greed, fear, sorrow, and resentment. But the poet stared into the campfire and did not speak. The next night, they brought more friends to the campfire and asked the poet to speak of the 7th story. The poet stared deep into the fire, thoughtful, and remained silent. Night after night, they returned with more and more of the young. The circle around the campfire grew, but each night there was only the sound of a crackling fire. Finally, one night, the poet looked up from the fire and saw the great crowd of the young gathered around, and she began to speak. Young of the people, if courage, hope, humility, and love burn strong and steady in your hearts like this warm fire, then you may leave the 6 stories of your parents behind. Instead of domination and oppression, choose service. Instead of revolution and revenge, choose reconciliation. Instead of accumulation and greed, choose generosity. Instead of purification and fear, choose solidarity. Instead of isolation and sorrow, choose neighborliness. Instead of victimization and resentment, choose liberation. This is the story of harmony, planted like a seed in your hearts. Well, how do we let the seed grow, the young asked. The poet circled the fire, looked deep in the eyes of the young, and spoke. Seek harmony, first of all, she said. And they repeated her words. Seek harmony first of all. Harmony with the great spirit that fills all creation. Harmony within your own soul. Harmony with your family, friends, and neighbors. Harmony with the vulnerable, the outcast, and the outsider. Harmony with the earth and all creatures. Harmony even with the enemy. Seek harmony first of all, and harmony will be your story. For many days, the young talked amongst themselves about the 6 stories, and especially about the 7th. Word got to the big men, and they were afraid. The big men quickly called everyone together in the center of the camp. Do you remember when the short people caused us so much trouble? We had to cleanse the land from them? The poet is a new troublemaker who divides the young from the old, and now we must cleanse the land again. Get up, come join us. The big men stirred up the people. They became a mob and circled the poet's camp. They tied up the poet's hands and feet, covered her mouth with an old rag. They did terrible things to her, things not even spoken of in whispers. The next morning, when the young saw that the poet was gone, they cried out in grief and anger. We must get revenge, one growled. Let us cleanse the old from the land, another yelled. Let us take all their wealth and become big men ourselves, screamed another. Let's run far away and form our own encampment, another shouted. Why even try, some cried. We have no future, all hope is gone. You see what we're doing? The youngest of the young said. We're forgetting what the poet taught us. We're choosing the 6 old stories, just as our parents did. And everyone was silent. In the days, months, and years that followed, first one, then a few, then many of the young decided to put these 6 old stories behind them. They chose the 7th story. And now, they invite you to join. Now I want to outline these 6 stories a bit more thoroughly. I call them the shadow stories because they appear as shadow sides of our good and legitimate desires for safety, peace, and prosperity. The domination story is us over them. It says we will never be safe unless we rule over them, unless we dominate and destroy our enemies. We see this story in the history of every empire ever. Roman, British, American, galactic, bringing freedom and peace and prosperity at the point of a sword or tank or lightsaber. It's any story where the solution is simply to kill, destroy, or oppress your enemies. The domination story is the shadow side of healthy leadership and the right use of power. The revolution, or better, the revenge story, is about us getting back at them. This story says that we will only be free once we do to them what they did to us. Historically, we see it in the cycles of violence and ongoing oppression that occur whenever a revolution becomes more about violent revenge than actual justice, and ends with the oppressed becoming the new oppressors. The revenge story is the shadow side of necessary resistance to injustice. It's not wrong to stand against oppression, but it is possible to do so in ways that seek to redeem once oppressors, not merely destroy them. The purification story is them away from us. This story says that they are the problem, whoever they are, and need to be separated from us if we are ever to be safe or prosperous. We see this in humanity's long and tragic history of racism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, witch hunts, and heterosexism, as well as our current polarized situation that treats people on the other side of any issue as irreconcilable enemies that simply need to be disempowered and disenfranchised. Purification story is the shadow side of healthy boundaries. Sometimes you do have to draw lines and say that some behaviors are simply unacceptable. The difference is whether you can still love the person apart from their behavior, or whether you've already defined them as wholly and irredeemably other. The flip side of the purification story is the isolation story, us away from them. The story says that we can only prosper if we separate ourselves from them. We can see this in religious fundamentalists who separate themselves from the world to avoid corruption, but then continue to argue and splinter into a dozen different sects. Or, on the progressive side, the way our isolationist safe spaces often degenerate into purity wars, where we quickly turn on anyone not deemed woke enough. The isolation story is the shadow side of the real need we all have to retreat occasionally to a safe place with like-minded people for renewal and refreshment. The victimization story is us in spite of them. It says that we will never have the power to end our suffering and oppression, so there's no point in even trying. In fact, our suffering is so much a part of our identity that we fight tooth and nail if anyone tries to take it away from us. We see this in all those who have given up hope. We feel so defeated and downtrodden that being defeated and downtrodden and resentful of those who defeated and trod on them has become the only thing they have left to hold on to. The victimization story is the shadow side of radical honesty about one has, in fact, been harmed by others, and legitimate anger and lament over that harm. Because for every person living in the victimization story, there are plenty of others who struggled just to acknowledge that a wrong was in fact done to them, that their suffering is not all their fault. And finally, the accumulation story simply says that life sucks and then you die, so just get whatever you can for yourself, even if it means others get less. Whoever dies with the most toys wins. It's the story that says life is about climbing the career ladder, making lots of money, affording all the best things and cool experiences. But it's not just the story of rich and successful people, it's also the story that tells the rest of us to continually distract ourselves with the next sports game, brunch outing, or Netflix show, to the point where we ignore the real suffering of others around us and do nothing to help make anything better. The accumulation story is the shadow side of properly enjoying God's good gifts. There's nothing wrong with wanting to savor life and experience good things, except when it harms others or leads us to indifference or inaction. Interestingly, each of these stories show up in the Bible as well, especially in the New Testament. The domination story is the long history of Israel's oppression by Egypt, Babylon, and Rome. The purification story is most identified with the Pharisees in the New Testament, who believe that if we could just purify the people from the sinners among us, that then God would deliver us from our oppressors. The isolation story we see in a group that's called the Essenes, that John the Baptist was probably a part of, whose solution was simply to withdraw into the desert and avoid engaging with Roman oppressors entirely. The accumulation story was the Sadducees and the Herodians that said, let's just collaborate with the Romans and get while the getting's good. While the Zealots are the violent revolution story, the attempts to overthrow Roman rule and reestablish an independent kingdom of Israel, which they tried to do several times and ultimately were crushed brutally, leading to the victimization story of later Judaism that just says we are people who have suffered and will always suffer. But there is a new and better story. A seventh story of collective liberation and reconciliation that teaches some of us or all of us. It says we're all in this together. So the only way to be truly free, secure, and prosperous is for more and more of us to choose to live our lives in harmony with and for the benefit of all. First for the liberation of the oppressed, but and also for the redemption of and reconciliation with oppressors. We see this story throughout the Bible. When God says to Abraham, "You are blessed to be a blessing." Or when Jonah, an Israelite, was told to demand repentance from, but also offer redemption to Israel's worst enemies. Or in the New Testament, as we read this morning, Mary sings about lifting up the lowly and bringing down the powerful. And Jesus declares good news for the poor and oppressed, but also commands us to love our enemies. The new story doesn't deny that there's oppression and violence, and it insists that liberation must always accompany reconciliation. But it also insists that the solution to oppression and violence is not simply more of the same. Instead, it insists that even our enemies can change, that even oppressive societies and systems can be transformed. It insists that forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation are always possible. But the new story won't just happen on its own. This story has only ever advanced when human beings have challenged systems that were considered unchangeable, while at the same time casting a proactive vision for the better world they want to see. It's not enough just to complain about what's wrong. As Richard Rohr says, the best critique of the bad is the practice of the better. So how do we start? How do we start to work towards the new story of liberation and reconciliation? Well, we do it every Sunday by gathering to remind ourselves of our identity as Christ followers. Because if you haven't figured it out yet, the new story is actually a very old story. It's the gospel story. Our spiritual practices are a way to stay rooted in that story so we can live it out day to day in our lives. We also do it by engaging in practical protest, politics, and service as we stand against injustice and try to turn the wheel of history ever so slightly towards something better. And we do it through our own creativity, through art and music, film and writing, and all the various tools that we use to reshape the landscape of our imaginations so that we can begin to picture what a world shaped by the new story might look like. And one way that I'm doing it is by organizing this festival. It's a 3-day gathering to inspire spirituality, social action, and creativity for the new story. Now you may be asking yourselves, why a festival? Well, speaking as a historian, I can tell you that from fiestas to church feast days, to revivals and camp meetings, to political conventions and rallies, large corporate gatherings have long been one of the tools that humans have learned to use to effect both personal and social transformation. In fact, civilization might have begun with a festival. The oldest religious site in the world is called the Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. It's about 12,000 years old and predates the formation of cities. It was a site where nomadic tribes would gather for religious festivals. And the chief archaeologist working on the site suggests that the first cities might have evolved as a way of providing for the logistical needs of these festivals. They needed a way to coordinate food and shelter and trade and leadership. So whatever year-round community gathered to organize these events may have provided the basis for the first long-term cities and civilization. Now, I'm not saying that our festival is going to reinvent civilization, but it could. We might need it to. What I am saying is that from the dawn of time, festivals have been the incubator for birthing all kinds of new possibilities. In her most recent book, Brené Brown asserts that these kinds of large collective gatherings are far more than just distractions. She says they provide opportunities to feel joy, social connection, meaning, and peace. They provide us with a sense of transcendence, communal identity, and higher purpose. I don't know about you, but I grew up going to church camp, which for me was always a time of fun and friendship, but also for inspiration, rededication to my deepest goals and spiritual ideals. Of course, I always came down from that spiritual high eventually, which is why I think we actually need these kinds of events regularly. Every year at least, but ideally every few months. In the Middle Ages, there was a major religious festival every season. That's why we were hoping to launch the new story as a biannual event, with a preview event in the fall, and then a full 3-day festival in the spring. Because we need regular gatherings like this to inspire us, help us feel connected, and then send us back out into the world to make a difference. We're organizing the New Story Festival around 3 emphases: creativity, spirituality, and social action. It's about bringing people together from diverse spheres: activists, social innovators, religious folks, spiritual practitioners, musicians, artists, storytellers, and more, to share the gifts that we each have to give with each other, and to get us out of our respective silos that we can begin working together. We'll have programming that engages all of those areas and more. Spiritual health and wholeness, big ideas, philosophy, theology, science, social activism, visual arts, performance arts, authentic relating and interpersonal connection, activities for kids and youth, and just playful fun and frivolity. I like to say that what we're doing is more purposeful than a music festival, more fun than a church conference, and more holistic than a political rally, with the best elements of all three. We want to transform individuals and transform society by engaging the whole range of human experience. We're kicking off in 1 month on November 3rd with a preview day, what we call the New Story Experience, with headliners Brian McLaren, the Justice Doula Mickey Scott Bay Jones, a feminist Muslim hip-hop artist, Mona Haydar, she's amazing, an Irish peace activist, film critic, and my festival co-founder, Garrett Higgins, as well as breakout sessions where you'll get a taste of all the different program areas that the March Festival will offer. It will be held just down the road at Houston-Tillotson University, and tickets are not expensive, but seats are limited, so if you're interested, I encourage you to get your tickets soon before they sell out. And bring a friend. It's going to be amazing. At the end of March, we'll be back at Houston-Tillotson for the full 3-day New Story Festival, with all of this and more: music, speakers, workshops, art, games, silent disco, beer and hymns, and deep conversations with new friends that you just met that just might become friends for life. Already for the March Festival, we've confirmed Nadia Bulls-Weber and Angel Kyoto Williams as main stage speakers, and we're close to confirming Reverend William Barber, the civil rights leader from North Carolina, as well. Over the Rhine and War and Treaty will perform from the main stage along with dozens of amazing local bands. It's going to be fun, inspiring, transformative, and just a good time that you won't want to miss. But like I said, I'm here because we need your help to pull it off. If you've liked what you've heard, if you want to get involved, I want to invite you to consider 3 things. 1, buy tickets, come to the event. Better yet, come as a congregation. Think about making it a church retreat, something that you experience together as a community. 2nd, help us spread the word. Get on our email list, join our Facebook group, follow us on Instagram, and then share our stuff with others. And finally, volunteer your time to help with our organizing efforts or at the events themselves. Actually, all of our volunteers attend for free. We don't want the price to be a barrier for anyone. So volunteering is a great way to both get to be at the festival, at the events, and then also be a part of this amazing community that we've created of people that are working to help make this happen. So if you're willing to help with any of those, there's a sign-up sheet at the back. Just put your name and email address there, and I'll be in touch. And I'll make sure you get on the email list so that you'll stay up to date with what's happening. Because again, this isn't just another fun event. It's about bringing the vision of a new story, that story of collective liberation and reconciliation, into reality in our lives, in this city, and in the whole world. It's already happening. We need your help.